chapter 4 is about sex, and this is another one that wouldn't be replicated as well, because she goes to a strip club to get the male experience of purchasing sex. That wouldn't be the case just because the amount of strip clubs have probably declined in terms of the amount of real estate that it would cost versus the amount of patrons that are going has gone down, probably with the advent of internet porn. And this isn't something she could have written the chapter about because porn is a purely consumer, non-social experience, and women and men consume porn differently, so you could never actually have the male porn consumer experience. So that just wouldn't be a possibility to write about.
Also, I mean, I think Dan will probably be more aware of this than I am, but I think strip clubs are still relatively common, mainly in larger cities. And
I noted that Swindon's got one. I walked past it the other day.
We do, don't we?
Yes.
I think strip clubs have always seemed like a very American thing to me. I don't know if that's accurate, just because... And this isn't me trying to cover up for myself. Honestly, legitimately, I've never been to one. No. So reading
I've spent hundreds of hours in them. I was in the city.
I'm certain that you have. But like reading the chapter that she wrote on it was an eye-opening experience for me in that sense, and also it really put me off. I mean, I already never wanted to go to them in the first place, but it really put me off even further because of how scuzzy it sounds. Although it sounds like she went to some particularly low.
She went to bad ones. It's like restaurants. You need to go to good ones.
I will also say that obviously she can't have the full male sexual experience, given that she is a woman dressed as a man. But narrowing it down purely to strip clubs for the sexual experience seemed like a very narrow way of trying to get into the male sexual experience. It's just you're going to meet very particular people if you go to those. You're going to meet particular women if you go to those. You're not going to get as broad a spectrum. But at the same time, given her narrowed options, I can understand why that was the easiest way for her to go.
Absolutely. The monastic one where she spends time in a monastery, that would probably still say the same, and that was chapter 5. The chapter on work might be a bit different, because I think the corporate environment...
Door-to-door salesman.
Yeah, again, it's a bit like the strip club. She chose the scuzziest possible end of that experience, and therefore I find those two chapters weaker.
But also the composition of the corporate environment has changed in terms of the diversity hires has changed workplace culture. It's a lot more stifling now. It's less bro-y than she would have represented here.
Yeah, even the cheap sales thing that she went into. Yeah.
Yes, and then the male self-help retreat one would probably still be the same, except it would probably be run by Hustlers University now instead.
Yeah.
So that's the basic chapter overrun.
Can I just don't know if we'll get onto it because it's more of an aside she does in one chapter. I forget which chapter it is, but I just wanted to mention that we were talking about her essay that she did against transsexualism and the interviews that she was doing where she said she felt more empathy to them. There is a particular page of the book where she discusses people's reactions to those of people of the opposite sex and of the same sex as them, and the way that they shift their behavioural patterns for them, completely unintentionally and unknowingly. They just do it as something natural. It's second nature to people, because as we all know, being able to recognise somebody's physical sex is one of the first things that you notice within a split second. It's what our brains are trained to do. And the fact that when she noticed that if people didn't realise if she was a man or a woman at first, because she was looking, maybe she hadn't applied her costume properly that day and she was looking particularly androgynous, that they would have this instant look of fear as they were trying to figure out, how should I address this person? How should I behave in front of this person? And that's another part, not to turn it all about transsexualism, about the transsexual experiences that most people are not going to pass in a million years, particularly male to female transsexuals. It's going to be very, very difficult for them to do so. So not only are you going to feel the disconnect of people not treating you in the way that you expect to be treated, you're actually putting everybody else through a quite distressing experience in having to try and tailor your behaviour to them at all times. It's like holding people hostage in a social situation.
This is something I've remarked almost in the inverse that men do, and this is part of my case for why men should wear suits more often. It doesn't just fill you with a sense of dignity, but it's also an act of social consideration, because it's a lot better to walk around in a civilization where people are well put together. And so you're showing courtesy to other people's eyeballs. This is something she even remarks on later on in her work chapter, where she says, I've been wearing baggy clothes as part of my disguise, mainly big hoodies and big t-shirts and jumpers and that. When I put on my suit for the first time, I felt powerful, and I realised that people were looking at me in the same way. And so she does get that imbuing of the same kind of commanding respect the man in a decently tailored suit will get. So in the same way as transsexuality and commanding pronouns is kind of a social power play, So is a suit. It's just a considerate one. And interesting that she
It's
recognised
often
that.
been remarked that the sorts of men who in their 50s revert to autogynephilia tended to be quite high testosterone in their earlier lives, primarily because it's just another power play for them, another way of exercising social control over other people in the way that they would have been more comfortable with when they were younger. Obviously, there's a degenerate sexual aspect of it as well, but there is another aspect to that.
Another aspect of the Dark Triad. Well, speaking of passing, then I suppose we'll get into the actual structure of the book. The first chapter is her mainly detailing how she went about the disguise. I mean, she was nearly 6 foot. She was sort of blokish in her aesthetic anyway, and she said that the way she went about the transformation in a kind of 12th night fashion was she had a unpadded sports bra to flatten her chest down. She was gluing fake stubble on every morning. She learned it from a drag
So she
kid,
went to an actual makeup artist. So she did several things. She went to a makeup artist and they did the trick of finely cut wool glued on to give the effect of stubble, which was apparently sufficient. She went to an acting coach and she did the whole posture and walking thing, because obviously that's quite different. And she went to a vocal coach who taught her how men project the voice, and it was things like women calling a taxi will halt, you command. Men just tend to instinctively give commands, whereas women will ask and try and pull in. That kind of thing. It's a different format. So she went through actually quite good prep in order to get there. But yes, it was all hinged on the fact that she started off as a butch lesbian, and so she was always seen as the masculine end of the female spectrum. However, that's interesting, and when we come to the dating aspect, we find that she was constantly struggling because she thought, being a macho woman, she was going to be able to pass as a man. When she tried to do dating, she got almost this sense of revulsion from women for being far too feminine.
She was nicknamed my gay boyfriend by one of them in particular.
Yeah.
And I did find it funny, like you say, I think she lists herself as 5'10" in this, and it's quite funny that a number of the male friends that she makes throughout this are actually all shorter than her. So that is one aspect of it that is easier for her to pass in that sense. But she still unknowingly will have a lot of feminine tics and feminine mannerisms that are easy for women to pick up on, if only because women, being the social creatures that they are built to pick up on them so that they're able to socialise more easily.
I will throw in some other random aspect as well and this I think is in the conclusion of the book, is that after she had been passing for a while with a particular group, be it the bowling guys or the monks or whatever, on a couple of occasions she kind of forgot herself, and she didn't tap down her breasts, she didn't apply the stubble, she basically turned up as a woman and nobody saw anything, even though she was stood there with breasts and a clean face.
She'd essentially socially conditioned them to not notice.
They didn't even look for it at that point, and so she was able to pass even as a woman.
But in the inverse, though, the women that notice it, they didn't notice she was a woman most of the time. Instead, they just noticed the markers of femininity as weak masculinity.
Yes.
And that put
They
them
just
off
thought
her.
she was gay.
Yeah, and
they were right in a sense.
And they were revolted by it.
Yeah, and when we mentioned the dating chapter, that actually brewed contempt in her for the barriers which men must face in order to approach women, and how dismissive they can be with their rejection. Hence, part of the reason, circling back to how the dating chapter would have changed, quite a lot of men establishing risk-averse behaviours in this day and age don't approach women because they are afraid of that rejection and the worse social consequences that might accrue as a result of Me Too. But yes, is that all we want to say about the first one before diving into her?
No,
actually doing the
I think she
experiments?
did a very good job setting herself up for this, and she took it seriously.
As best as you can, trying to perform this kind of experiment.
Yeah, so her first experiment was going and joining the all-male bowling team. And she wanted a competitive sport because she wanted to see how men socialised and brought each other up. And there was a really interesting bit that I found here. So her interactions with her teammates and her opponents was, I was surrounded by men who had cement dust in their hair and sawdust under their fingernails. They had nicotine-shadowed faces that looked like ritual masks, and their hands were as tough and scarred as falcon gloves. These were men who, as one of them told me later, had been shoveling shit their whole lives. Looking at them, I thought, it's at times like these when the term real man really hits home with you, and you understand in some elemental way that the male animal is definitely not a social construct. Now, when she met these men, one of the things that she noticed how they established respect reciprocally was the handshake. She said, from the outside, the handshake, this ritual, had always seemed overdone to me by all the macho ceremony, but from inside it was completely different. There was something so warm and bonded in this handshake. Receiving it was a rush and instant inclusion in a camaraderie that felt very old and practiced. To me, woman-to-woman introductions often seemed fake and cold, full of limp gentility. I've seen a lot of women hug one another this way too, sometimes even women who have known each other for a long time and think of themselves as good friends. They're like two backward magnets pushed together by convention. Their arms and cheeks meet and maybe the tops of their shoulders, but only briefly, the briefest time politeness will allow. It's done out of habit and for appearances, a hollow, even resentful gesture bred into us and rarely felt. The solidarity of sex was something that feminism tried to teach us, and something, it now seemed to me, that men had figured out long ago and perfected a long time ago. On some level, men didn't need to learn or remind themselves that brotherhood was powerful. It was just something they seemed to know. When this man whom I'd never met shook my hand, he gave me something real. He included me. Most of the women I'd ever shaken hands with or even hugged had held something back, as if we were in constant competition with each other, or secretly suspicious, knowing it but not knowing it, and going through the motions all the same. In my view, bra burning hadn't changed all that much.
And that's why this is a good book.
Yes.
Because insights like that.
Yeah.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.